let's start by bringing in our data. So up in the In and Out tab, we're going to add the Input Data tool to our canvas and navigate to where we have saved our file. This is called Hotel Bookings. It's a CSV. So we'll go ahead and read this in and execute the workflow. So what we're going to start with is combining this arrival date year, arrival date month, and arrival date day of month into a single field where it's month, day, year. And then after we combine those, we're going to use those arrival dates along with our reservation status date to calculate the stay durations and then look at the first and last bookings for the year. So to start, let's add a formula tool to our canvas. So underneath the preparation tab, we'll use the formula. It's the tool with the beaker icon on it. We'll add this right after our input data tool. So the configuration for this tool exists of the ability to, underneath the output column, we can create a new column to add to our data table or overwrite and edit any existing field within our data. In this white space, we can write and define our own expressions and calculations to perform on our data. Additionally, to the left, we have this functions button, which provides a repository of pre-configured Alteryx functions. And so when you select any of these, they populate into the expression editor and provide you with values that you replace and update relevant to your data. Then there's this Chi button, and this consists of any values within our data that we can access to bring into our expressions, as well as system constants. And then we can choose to navigate with the folder icon to any recent expressions we've written or saved. The last icon is how we can save expressions to use in later workflows. Additionally, within the formula tool, we can set the data type. So if we are creating a new column, we can set the data type as needed. However, if we're overwriting a field within our data, we cannot update the data type. Along with that is the size. So again, if we're creating a new, we can change the size. Otherwise, if we're overwriting, that size value is going to be fixed. Within the data preview up top, this will populate as we start writing expressions with a snapshot of what our data manipulations are doing to our data. And then the last really cool thing about the formula tool is with this plus icon, we can add additional expressions. So we can combine and stack multiple expressions within a single formula tool and apply them to either the same data or different data fields consisting in our data. So let's go ahead and start with our example. So we're going to first take our arrival date year, month, and day of month fields and combine them into a single column. So back in the formula tool, in the expression editor, we're going to start by just typing in the field we would like to pull in. So we're going to start with the month. So as you recall, the field was called arrival date month. So if I just start typing, we get this pre-populated suggestion of fields in our data. So we can either with our mouse click or use the up-down arrows and tab to bring these values into the expression editor. So we're going to choose the arrival date month. And you'll see the data preview is populated. And so now we're essentially taking those three fields and combining them into a single string. And a string is a text value that consists of alphanumeric characters. And so to combine them, Alteryx can concatenate them using the plus symbol. So once we have this first field, we'll go ahead and add a plus. And then we'll have a space, so that's designated between quotation marks. Then another plus, and here's where we're going to add our day of month. So again, I'm going to start typing arrival date, day of month, and select that field. Again, I'm going to add a plus, and this time between quotation marks, we want a comma, then a space. And then our last field we need to add is our arrival date year. Now we see our data preview has populated. The last thing we need to do is create this as a new column. So we're going to choose from this dropdown, add column, and I'm going to call this arrival date string. Let's go ahead and execute the workflow. And all the way to the right, we have this new field added arrival date string with our month, day, year format. The next thing we need to do is cast these two date values to a date objects that Alteryx recognizes so we can perform those calculations to find the durations. And so we'll start with our reservation status date. We can actually convert this within our formula tool. So over in the configuration window, we're going to choose the plus to add a new expression. And the function to convert this is called toDate. So if you start typing in toDate, you see the suggestion box, and we want this function that's just plainly toDate. And what we need to do is replace this X with the value from our data. So go ahead and remove that, and we'll bring in our reservation status. So we just start typing. We want our reservation status date field. And we want to create this as a new column because we need to update the data type. So we're going to choose add new column, and we will designate this as status date. The last piece we need to do is update our data type. So if you click this dropdown, we're going to navigate to the date type. Once this is all set up, we can run the workflow. And now you see on the furthest right, we have our new status date. Now we have to do the same thing. We have to convert our arrival date to a date time object. Now this is a little bit different formatting because we have our month spelled out and then a day, 4-digit year. And so this is not as easily recognized and converted by Alteryx, so we have to use an additional tool to convert this. Up in our tool palette under the Parse tab, we're going to add this date time tool to our workflow. What this does is allows you to convert between strings and date time objects. So first we need to set the field we're going to convert. Using the dropdown, choose the field of concern. So that's our arrival date string. Then we need to name the output field. I'm going to call this arrival date. And the last piece is choosing the matching format of the input. So if you'll recall, we had month spelled out, followed by day, and then a 4-digit year. That matches this structure where it's month, 2-digit day, 4-digit year. Once you have this selected, that's all we need to set up in this tool. Then we can run it. And then now we see we have our arrival date and our status date fields, which are now ready to be used in a calculation so we can find the duration or the difference between these two values. We're going to add another tool, formula tool, to the canvas. So we'll add it right after our date time. In here, we're going to define our expression. So this is where we're finding the difference between our status date and our arrival date. If we go to the functions button and go to the date time and click this arrow, it'll show us all the existing date time functions that Alteryx supports. And we're going to select this one called date time diff. And we have to replace DT1, DT2, and U with values we want. So for DT1, I'm going to put in our status date. And we need to make sure we choose the most recently created field. And then for DT2, this is going to be our arrival date. Now, once we have those two fields set, the last piece we need to update is the U, and this represents our units. So we could set this to months, days, or years, but for the context of this problem, days makes the most sense. So within quotation marks, we're going to add days. And because we're creating this calculation, we need to create a new column as well. So up top, add a new column, and let's call this our stay duration. And because it's producing a 0, we're expecting it to be an integer value that represents the number of days. So we need to make sure our date aligns with that, or excuse me, our data type aligns with that. So from this dropdown, we're going to choose int 16, and this just represents a numerical value that's an integer. Okay, so once you have created the new field, you have your expression written out, and you set the date type to integer, we can go ahead and run the workflow. Over on the right, you see we have all our durations populated, but we run into an issue a little bit ways down where we have negative values. And that doesn't necessarily make sense because you can't have a negative span of days. And so when I look over, we can actually see that there's this column called reservation status, and those negatives correspond to when the status is canceled. So we only want our stay durations to have values when they actually have stayed in the hotel and checked out. So we're going to add a conditional statement to update our stay duration column. Within the formula tool, let's go ahead and select the plus to add a new expression. And this time we're actually going to overwrite a current field. So let's go ahead and set that first. From the dropdown, we'll go ahead and scroll down until we see our stay duration field, and we'll select this one. And now we're going to do some conditional expressions. We'll go ahead and access this by going to our functions button. And underneath the conditional section, we'll choose the dropdown. And we're going to choose this first one where it's if then else statement. The values we need to update here are the C, T, and F. Starting with the C, this is what we're going to evaluate against and what condition we want to match. So we want to check if the reservation status is checkout. So editing here, we're going to bring in our reservation status column. And we want to validate whether or not this equals checkout. So we can just set it equals. And because we're working with a string, our comparison value needs to be within quotation marks. And we're going to make this checkout, making sure we match the values contained within our data. So it's a check followed by a hyphen and then out. So then when this is true, we want to keep our stay duration value as is. So when this condition is validated, we want to just maintain our status date field. So we'll go ahead and bring that value in here. However, if it's not status checkout, we want to set the duration to 0. Oh, and this was actually supposed to be our stay duration, not status. So we should have, if reservation status equals checkout, then our stay duration field. Otherwise, or else, set it to 0. Now when we click run, we see that these values down here are no longer negative, they're set to 0. Okay, now let's calculate the first booking of the year, the last, as well as the average stay duration. We can do this with the Summarize tool. So underneath the Transform tab, we're going to add this Summarize tool to the end of our workflow. And within this essentially aggregates our data so we can look at a higher level summary. And so over in the configuration window, we have a list of all the fields contained within our data. And by selecting a specific one, so I'm going to go ahead and select arrival date year. And these are the fields that we're going to bring in and aggregate to our output. So once I have the field selected, arrival date year, I can click this add button. And this is where I can choose what method of aggregation I want to apply, or if I want it to be a grouping, so defining the parameters in which we're aggregating our data, that'll be done by the group by. So when I set arrival date to group by, you see it populates down here, and this is where our outputs are going to be. And so essentially by setting arrival date year, every unique year within our data is going to be a single record, and all our other information is going to be aggregated to the year level. So now that we have that set, we want to look at our arrival dates. So I'm going to scroll and find our arrival date field and highlight it. And then I'm going to click the add again. And this time we can actually choose a method of aggregation to summarize this information. And as you scroll through these, some of them are grayed out. For example, the sum, or if I go down to numeric, you see a lot of these are grayed out. And that's just because Alteryx is smart enough to recognize the data type. And by graying it out, that method of aggregation is not supported for the particular data field. So it kind of gives us an indication of how we should be choosing to aggregate our data. And because we're doing arrival date, we want the first of the year. So that corresponds with the minimum value. And with that, we also want the last booking of the year. So again, making sure our arrival date is selected, we're going to choose the maximum. And with our output, we can also update the output field name. So it defaults by adding this prefix, but I'm just going to go ahead and click into this edit box and replace min with first. And the max I'm going to replace with last, just to give more context. So this is going to be our first and last bookings of the year. Now the final piece I want in my aggregation is our average durations. So I'm going to select our stay duration field up in this first box, and I'm going to choose my aggregation method. I'm going to go down to the numeric option and choose average. And this will calculate our average durations for each year. So those are the 4 fields we want in our output. Once you have these all set up, we can run and look at what it produces. So here we have each year's on a separate record, and we have our first date, last date, and then the average duration calculated. That is all for this example.